Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you and welcome to the first in our new series of Doha debates, coming to you from the Gulf state of Qatar and sponsored by the Qatar Foundation. Governments in the West insist they don't talk to terrorists, but history would suggest otherwise. The British government used to have secret meetings with the IRA, the Spanish with ETA, and Nelson Mandela, once reviled as a terrorist by prominent politicians, has just had his statue unveiled in London. So should governments engage with the men of violence in this region? That's the question underlying our motion tonight. This House believes it's time to talk to Al-Qaeda. Well, speaking in favour of the motion, Terry Waite, once the envoy to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He made a name for himself getting hostages freed in the Middle East. But in 1987, his own luck ran out. He was abducted in Lebanon and held captive for 4 years, most of the time in solitary confinement. He now fills his days lecturing, writing and broadcasting. With him, Asad Durrani, who rose sharply through Pakistan's military establishment to become head of its intelligence agency, the ISI. He retired from that world in the 90s, only to become a diplomat, serving his country as ambassador to Germany and Saudi Arabia. Well, against the motion, Laith Kubba, spokesman for one of Iraq's recent prime ministers, Ibrahim al-Jafari. Born in Baghdad, he's now Senior Director for Middle East and North Africa at the National Endowment for Democracy, a think tank based in Washington. And with him, Adam Holloway, who's been both a Special Forces officer fighting in the First Gulf War, then a television journalist covering the conflict in Bosnia. These days, he gets to eat at the British House of Commons as a Conservative Member of Parliament, where he sits on the influential Defence Select Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. And now let me call on Terry Waite, first of all, to speak for the motion.
I'd like to begin by making what I believe to be four very simple, straightforward points. First of all, to say that my own position is that I do not in any way support acts of violence that cause death or injury to innocent people. And I believe that war should be an absolute last resort. Those who bomb from 50,000 feet or blow up buildings on the ground are both dealing in death, and I condemn that. Secondly, when we look at the issue before us tonight, we need to be able to ask, who is Al-Qaeda? In my view, it is an organization that has been granted greater organizational capacity than it in fact has. But it is, in my view, the extreme edge of insurgency in the Islamic world. Thirdly, when we look at the evidence, as was suggested in the introduction, for dialogue, we have overwhelming evidence that in fact dialogue is the way to resolve problems. The IRA, the PLO, the ANC, and of course, very recently, on a different scale, with North Korea and Christopher Hill's negotiations, and also in the last few days in Finland, when two unlikely characters, Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, sat down with Shia and Sunni representatives from Iraq to enter into dialogue, unthought of a year ago. Finally, I cannot think of an insurgency or terrorist movement that has been defeated by bombing and warfare. My own experience in Lebanon, in Iran, and in Libya has actually demonstrated the fact that you can talk to people whose stated position seems to be impossible, but you can talk to them. I know that from personal experience. Terrorism is a symptom. It's not a root issue. You must deal with the root issue, and the only way to deal with the root issue is not to drive people against the wall by bombing and fighting, but by entering into dialogue. To conclude, Churchill said, jaw, jaw, meaning speak rather than war, war. And I agree with Churchill. Let us talk rather than engage in fighting.
Terry Waite, thank you very much indeed. Why talk to Al-Qaeda now?
What we have to say is that Al-Qaeda is a name that covers a multitude of activities, and
including beheading people on television.
And indeed it does.
And you think you can find common ground with people who do that?
The more you engage in warfare, the more you encourage the extremist. For example,
could you just accept my question? Can you find common ground with people who behead other people on television?
I think you